Things are moving full steam ahead this 89th legislative session, and state lawmakers are working on critical pieces of legislation. With so much already in the works, TPPF is doing its part to help the public stay informed by asking our friends to stop by on occasion and tell us about the liberty-minded efforts they're working on to keep Texas moving in the right direction. I'm Jose Melendez, campaign director of TPPF's Taxpayer Protection Project, and today I'm with Mark Meckler, president of Convention of States. Mark, welcome.
Good day. Good to be with you.
Excellent. So today we're going to delve into the matter of Convention of States, what it entails, and what it would mean for the future of our nation. To kick things off, tell us what Convention of States is, what an Article 5 convention is, and talk to us about the history of this matter.
Sure. So simply put, Article 5 is contained in the Constitution. It contains the two ways that we can amend the Constitution. The first way is when 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose an amendment. Then it goes out to the states for ratification by 38 states, 3/4 of the states. The second way, which we've never used, is 2/3 of the states have the power to call for a convention. Then Congress names the date and time, and the states gather in convention to propose amendments. If 51% of them, 26 out of the 50 states, agree to propose an amendment, that goes out to the states for ratification, again, by 3/4 of the states. And so we've never done this in all of American history. It got in the Constitution just before the end of convention in 1787. September 15th, Colonel George Mason stood up, said we had a problem with the document. We'd given the power to Congress to propose amendments, but not to the people acting through the states. And he asked a question, would we ever expect a Congress or a federal government that becomes a tyranny to propose amendments to restrain their own tyranny? And obviously human nature says no. And so they proposed that we give the states this right. And that's what we're pursuing at the Convention of States Project.
Excellent. Can you give us a walkthrough of what you're trying to accomplish here this Texas legislative session through an Article 5 convention?
Sure. So far, 19 states have called for a convention of states, and they're calling for three things to be discussed at convention. First is anything that would impose term limits on Congress, and not just Congress, but federal employees, federal officers. And so that would include people like Anthony Fauci, bureaucrats, staffers. I call it the Fauci Amendment. We never want to see another Anthony Fauci there for 40 years amassing that kind of power. Also could include the judiciary, the federal judiciary. So term limits is one thing. Second is anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Things like a balanced budget amendment, tax caps, spending caps, and I think importantly, imposing generally accepted accounting principles on the federal government. And then finally, anything that would impose scope or jurisdiction limitations on the federal government. Simply put, that means going back to something like the enumerated powers, saying that the federal government may not be involved in things like education or energy or healthcare or the environment. These are things that were always meant for the people in the states, and the federal government has usurped those powers. So those are the kinds of things that could be discussed at a convention.
So what might be other issues important to Texans that an Article 5 convention can be utilized for?
Yeah, I mean, to Texas specifically, I think one of the most important is our energy industry. We have had Washington, D.C. meddling in our energy industry since at least the 1970s, via the Department of Energy, via the EPA and environmental regulations, shutting down drilling based on some lizard that they found that they want to protect, and really telling us how we can explore and exploit our own energy resources. I think that for Texans, we should really be in support of doing away with the EPA, doing away with the Department of Energy. Texas is very good at managing its own energy and energy infrastructure, and we ought to focus on Texans doing that.
What does the outlook look for Texas once enough states have passed resolutions to call for a convention?
Yeah, I think Texas will be one of the states leading the convention. And I'm really happy to say Governor Abbott led the way when we originally passed the resolution back in 2017. He made it one of his priority items. He wrote a book on the subject, and he laid out what he called the Texas Plan. And I think this has a historical analogy. The Virginia Plan was brought by the Virginia delegates to the original convention in 1787. And they really led the way in drafting the Constitution because they came with a plan. So Governor Abbott laid out a bunch of amendments that he thinks would be appropriate for Texans to lead the way with. And I think just based on the size of the state, our population, Governor Abbott's leadership to date, that Texas would be one of the leading states at convention.
So some people say that they fear the possibility of a runaway convention. How do you respond to those folks?
Yeah, I want to start with the history of where that came from. I think this is important. So back in the, say, early 1970s, nobody had ever heard of the idea of a runaway convention. Unfortunately, there's a now infamous letter between Phyllis Schlafly, the founder of Eagle Forum, and Chief Justice Warren Burger. It's important to remember Chief Justice Burger is the Chief Justice that gave us Roe versus Wade. And he and Schlafly had become friends, and she wrote him a letter asking him what he thought of the idea of a convention. And he said, it's a terrible idea. We might have a runaway convention and lose our beloved Constitution. Interestingly, at the time, there was a major effort by the states to overturn Roe versus Wade via a convention. And so he was protecting the seminal decision of his lifetime. And unfortunately, that got spread around by Phyllis Schlafly. I think she was a great and wonderful woman, but she was wrong on this issue. And there really is no risk of a runaway convention. That was invented by the radical left to keep conservatives from using the Constitution to save the Constitution. So that's the history of where it came from. Over the years, that myth has been expanded by the left. Berger went and got professors at Harvard and Yale to write law review articles about it. And today, if you go to the website of Common Cause, they've led an effort against this for a long time. There's a multi-page website dedicated to attacking the idea of calling a convention of states. Over 250 leftist groups have signed on to that effort. It's everybody from Planned Parenthood to La Raza, MoveOn.org, Common Cause, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Legal Women Voters, you name it. If a group is on the left, they've signed on to this. So oftentimes you can tell an effort by its enemies, and the enemies of the Convention of States movement are about 98% on the left at this point. So, and then finally, it's just a matter of process and structure. The framers were incredible at process. They designed a process that prevents anything like a runaway convention. First of all, we've had over 40 conventions in American history, not Article 5 conventions, but where states have gathered and they've enabled delegates to go in and discuss a limited amount of topics. We have no history of any runaway convention in the history of the United States of America. If the delegates go to convention and they were to do something that the states didn't want, they always have the right to recall their delegates, to control the votes of their delegates, to replace their delegates. And ultimately, even if something we didn't like came out of convention, it takes 38 states to ratify anything that comes out of convention. And Jose, I'll make this offer to your viewers. I've made it to literally millions of people across the country. My email address is mmeckler@cosaction.com. I've said if you're worried about this, then tell me what amendment you're worried about and list the 38 states that will ratify it. I can tell you in doing this for 11 years, I've never gotten an email that answers that request.
Final question. So you've made it across the state. You've talked to fellow Texans all over. What feedback have they given you on convention of states ahead of this legislative session?
Yeah, the feedback's been incredible across the state. We have over 250,000 activists, people who've signed our petition in the state. What's going on right now in Texas is there is an expiration of the application that the Texas legislature made in 2017. This is the year that will expire. And our argument is that liberty never expires. It would be really embarrassing, actually, for Texas if this were to expire. Oklahoma had one of these expirations. They removed it and repassed the application cleanly. Missouri had one. They removed it and passed the application cleanly. I was just in Nebraska. Nebraska passed their application very recently. They're removing their expiration right now. For Texas to backslide would be terrible, and the people of Texas want to step forward and stay in the forefront of this movement to call a convention of states.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.